Christmas and Happy New Year 2022 from our house to yours. Again this year I'm going to be reading a Christmas story that I wrote in my newsletter that we sent out, but I hope you enjoy it. This year my Christmas story was inspired by our recent trip and many trips to the Oregon coast, but sometimes a great notion. You can have your own personally autographed copy if you have not received one in the mail already, for no fee. But it starts this way. What remembrances spring to mind when you hear the phrase heaven touching earth? My own thoughts immediately turn to times and places along the Oregon coast. Yvonne and I exchanged vows in 1983, exactly 8 weeks after she accepted my proposal. I was thrilled when she said yes. She inquired what date we might plan for the wedding and initially agreed that Thanksgiving weekend would be fine. But as the conversation progressed, a question arose in her mind. So she asked, "You mean this Thanksgiving?" You see, I had resigned as youth pastor at the church in Zilla, had no intention of moving elsewhere without her. So rather than extend the stress of wedding planning over months or years, we were able to compress all the tension into a much more compact time frame. To a typical male, this might be viewed as a thoughtful gesture on my part. A typical female might view it as differently, but she went for it anyhow. The wedding was wonderful, but in some ways it was even more marvelous to head out afterward. Our first night beyond the valley, our room overlooked a waterfall on the grounds of the historic Columbia Gorge Hotel in Hood River, Oregon. I didn't have time to include some of the highlights, which I'll be including for your pleasure today on this video, but Yvonne was gone during the summer on a missions tour in Europe, and I had dreams that she would someday become my bride, and our youth group, for which I was youth pastor, was stopped at a Charburger hamburger joint, which was right nearby the Columbia Gorge Hotel. And that summer I can remember taking leave of my youth group for just running over a few blocks over to the Columbia Gorge Hotel and grabbing a brochure with the notion in mind that perhaps we could spend our honeymoon night there. And lo and behold, just actually the second night we were there, but we enjoyed an elegant breakfast, including delicious pancakes skillfully topped with honey from the sky from a pitcher above our heads. To me, it was splendidly symbolic of heaven touching earth in my life. Then on to Cannon Beach, where as newlyweds we walked the shoreline hand in hand before snuggling in for the evening in front of a romantic fireplace in the Haystack Motel. We have frequently revisited that same coastline, compliments of Cannon Beach Conference Center. They sponsor a pastor's getaway program, 3 nights free lodging, a blessing that we have experienced at least every other year since then. It's still a thrill to remember when the two of us first saw heaven touch earth on the ocean horizon there. 25 minutes south on Highway 101, the yurts in the Halem Bay State Park became base camp for a dozen spring break expeditions with the Hoffmans. Beginning in the late 1990s, every first week of April we geared up with sleeping bags and rubber boots for another conquest of the beach. Fueled by Walt's world-famous sliced potatoes and ham breakfast, we commenced many an excursion along the shorelines and sand dunes. I just take a brief pause here to I don't know if you hear a groaning in the background. That is Shade. Shade is still alive. She made it through December last year and has made it through December again this year, but she has her trials and tribulations, but we're just so glad that she's still with us, right, children? But she may be groaning and barking. Don't be distracted. Fueled by Walt's world-famous sliced potatoes and ham breakfasts, we commenced many an excursion along the shorelines and sand dunes. And what parade on earth could surpass the glorious sight of all 10 of us traversing the bike paths together, Particularly impressive are memories of determined young riders facing into the elements with black garbage bag rain gear, billowing out like hornet bodies behind them. In the early days, training wheels were part of the scene, and I dare say once again, it was like heaven touching earth. We eventually purchased a WorldMark membership. This has often allowed us to enjoy a rejuvenating week, watching from the windows as mighty waves crash below upon the rocks of Depot Bay. This October, we headed there once again. We traveled through Lincoln City and a mile southward passed by the Siletz Bay National Wildlife Refuge. For many years, I have been intrigued by the twisting channels here which meander through estuary grasses, fresh waters, mingling with the sea. Year after year, these canal-like waterways seem to cry out, "Explore me." In response to that invitation, my family has often heard me wistfully declare, "Someday." My son David has often listened to this longing of my heart and decreed its fulfillment. Last Christmas, he made a promise to take me there. And so, in the spirit of Lewis and Clark, earlier visionaries who also possessed the notion to visit the Oregon coast, David and I made plans to chart our own course through those wetland acres. And so it came to pass that, blessed with a day of decent October weather, we were outfitted with kayaks and gear from a business at the mouth of the Siletz River. They shuttled us to a launch site 2 miles upstream. Incoming tides actually reversed the river current, up to 12 miles from what I understand, so we had to paddle against slight resistance for a half mile downriver to reach the place where the Millport Slough branches off and births its own winding path seaward. We were told there was an imposing old house which would signal our point of departure from the main river channel. We learned that the movie Sometimes a Great Notion, starring Henry Fonda and Paul Newman, had been filmed in this area. The house was built as part of the movie set to serve as the home site of a cantankerous old Henry Stamper and his disturbed family of loggers. The motto of the clan was, "Never give an inch." They stubbornly refused to shut down their independent operation to join in solidarity with the local union-sponsored strike. It was nominated for Oscar Award for the title song, Family of Man, which was sung by Charlie Pride. It was released exactly 50 years ago, in December of 1971. It never attained huge box office success, but is credited with some of the most iconic scenes of that motion picture era. The rugged coastal beauty is majestic, but there is also a memorable scene in which the desk of a union executive is chainsawed in half while he sits behind it, and a heart-wrenching effort to free a man pinned beneath a huge log with the tide coming in. The culminating scene of the movie prominently features Henry's dismembered arm, which had been previously severed by a falling tree. Beware of any tale that's built around a rugged group of loggers. I might mention I'm not recommending the movie. I have not seen it. I had the idea as we were there in Depot Bay this October, it'd be a fun family film to watch, and so I kind of previewed it on YouTube, and it starts out with him driving a neighbor away from his boat dock, throwing sticks of dynamite and hurling profanities. Contains some immorality apparently, and the dismembered arm scene. I thought maybe this would not be appropriate for my family. They sometimes think that I pick out losers of movies, but anyhow, that just gives you, the Family of Man, the theme song. I used to have that on my 8-track that I played back in high school. Charlie Pride, we're all his children, his next of kin. That's the way it began. We're all part of the family of man. I thought it'd be heartwarming, beautiful movie to watch together, but decided against it. The movie derives its title from the traditional folk song, "Good Night, Irene, I'll See You in My Dreams," as originally recorded by the infamous blues and folk artist Lead Belly, king of the 12-string guitar, one of the great artists of that day. He was recorded actually in prison when they recorded that song and others back in about 1933. But one of the verses expresses the heartache of lost love with these words: "Sometimes I live in the country, sometimes I live in the town. Sometimes I get a great notion to jump into the river and drown." I don't know if you can hear the groaning in the background, but I believe that Shade, our dog, is feeling the emotion of what I'm saying and groaning along with us. This song actually became #1 hit in 1950. A group called the Weavers sang it. It was #1 for 13 weeks. Billboard magazine named it the #1 song of the whole year. Unfortunately, Leadbelly died in 1949. He did not get to see the popularity of his theme song. Not that he had written it, he just recorded it. But my dad had heard that song. He and my mother were married in 1953, and her maiden name, or her middle name, was Irene, Hannah Irene Foster. And so I would hear, as I was growing up, my dad singing "Good Night, Irene," referring to my mother as Irene the Siren, of course. But it was a famous movie. But those lines were the lines of a man whose wife had left him. Apparently, he wanted to jump in the river and drown. Little did I realize that there might soon arise a curious connection between that sentiment and my own situation. David and I had an awesome day navigating through that 660-acre maze of waterways. Once again, heaven touched earth on the Oregon coast. Especially fascinating to me were the passages so narrow that we had to push and pull against the grassy banks because there was no room to paddle alongside the boat. After several hours of grand adventure, we re-entered the main river just above the rental site. Upon arrival there, the manager pulled our kayaks up onto the boat ramp. The wind was a bit cool, but we had managed to stay remarkably dry. I extricated my legs from the confinement of the cockpit and attempted to stand up and step outward towards nearby dry land. Suddenly, my thigh was beset with a massive muscle cramp. The kayak was already situated on an uphill slant, and with the rounded bottom teetering side to side, the additional complication of this debilitating Charlie horse significantly impacted my ability to successfully exit the vessel. I commenced an ungraceful moonwalk backward across the top shell of the kayak, desperately attempting to regain my balance. Recovery was not to be. Gravity accelerated the speed of my downward descent, culminating in calamity when I reached the end of the boat. At this point, I found myself launched into a terrifying backwards plunge toward the murky depths of the mighty Siletz River. Thankfully, my life preserver prevented baptism by full immersion. I lay floating upon the surface, face upward, momentarily stunned, but quickly reviving as the chilly waters permeated my clothing. I summoned every last ounce of strength, and was able to rise up and somehow establish my footing in the treacherous, knee-deep waters. In the warmth of the car afterward, as David drove us back to the resort, we were able to actually chuckle about the incident. I felt this was important, lest he be scarred and crippled by traumatic memories. I was concerned that this event might have triggered recollections of an occurrence in his recent home remodeling project. I had suffered a slight misstep, inadvertently found myself landing shoulder blade first in a batch of concrete self-leveler, freshly poured upon the floor in preparation for tiling. But that is another story. The legend continues. Well, we returned to civilization, and my dear son bravely attempted to convey the upsetting tale to his mother. As he recounted the details of that agonizing scene, raw sensations surged to the surface. His whole body was apparently so racked with sobs, suspiciously disguised as guffaws and chortles, that he struggled to even complete whole sentences. Despite being doubled over with emotion and gasping for breath, he finally made it through. Others might misunderstand this outward facade as extreme merriment, but surely it was a macho cover-up for the deep distress of the lad for his dad. I'm glad he was able to confront those and verbalize those dark memories. Better to release your emotions than to lock them up inside. In retrospect to that day, I have pondered the connection between two notable occasions a half-century apart. My accident transpired just a mile downriver from the filming location of Sometimes a Great Notion, which title had been inspired by those disheartening lyrics, "Sometimes I get a great notion to jump in the river and drown." Probably just a coincidence. No great notion on my part was involved in that dramatic river entry. But notions can have consequences. Where would I be today if I had never pursued the great notion to ask Yvonne to become my wife? If I had abandoned my great notion to explore the Siletz Bay wetlands, I might have missed out on this whole memorable adventure. Why do we spend so much time on the Oregon coast? Simply because we are compelled by a great notion to visit the ocean where happiness comes in waves. And you know, every great invention, every great advance of science and technology, every great new exploration usually happens because somebody had a great notion, and there are always naysayers that say that it could never happen, but we do it anyhow. There are some not so great notions also with corresponding repercussions. Why do we have school shootings? Because somebody took a notion that was not so great. In the Bible story, Adam and Eve succumbed to the notion that they would be better off to disobey God. They lost their innocence, discovered a world of hurt. Worst of all, their connection with God was broken, and the fallout extended to the whole human race. But God conceived a great notion to bring us back to himself. It was unveiled that first Christmas. This time, heaven didn't touch earth on the Oregon coast. Instead, it happened in Bethlehem. A newborn baby was wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger. Eventually, he was wrapped in grave clothes and laid in a tomb. Sometimes a great notion comes with a great cost, but the Father thought that you were worth it. Everyone has their own notions about God, life and death, and everything in between. Some people have the notion that there is no God. Some have the notion there is a God, but they don't need a Savior. Others have the notion that God never could or would forgive them. In the words of a popular song, Reckless Love, oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, and I don't deserve it. Still, you give yourself away. Sometimes a great notion makes no earthly sense. When I was your foe, still your love fought for me. You've been so, so good to me. When I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. Sometimes our great notions don't amount to much. Sometimes a great notion originates in the heart of God. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year 2022. And theological footnote. God's love is not actually reckless, but to the casual observer it might surely seem so.
Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dream. Last Saturday night I got married. Me and my wife settled down. Now me and my wife are parting. I'm gonna take another stroll downtown. Well, Irene, good night. Irene, good night. Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dream.
Stop your gambling. Stop staying out late at night. Go home to your wife and family. Stay there by your fireside bright.